My name's Andy Doughton. I'm the chair of something called the Wilberforce Lecture Trust, which I'll tell you a word more about in a moment. But the most important thing is to welcome you here to what was Central Methodist Hall, now Jubilee Church, and Dr. Helen Pankhurst, who's going to be taking up about an hour and 20 minutes of your time in a quite an energetic and participatory way. So I hope you're going to enjoy it. So thank you for coming. One or two words about, I'll say a bit more about Helen in a moment. One or two words about the Lecture Trust, the Wilberforce Lecture Trust. Say again? Speak up. Okay. They can turn me up. The important bit hasn't started yet, so they can always turn me up. Yeah, the Wilberforce Lecture Trust. If you want to know anything about it, basically it's quite simple. You go to the website. If you put in words of approximately that nature, you'll find it. And on there, you will find a lecture just about annual. Sometimes there's been one or two more a year from quite a lot of interesting people. Helena Ashwari, Desmond Tutu, bloke who wrote about Russia's mafia state, Luke Harding, a couple of years ago. All sorts of interesting people talking about human rights, world politics and the effect on human rights, global poverty, all sorts of very interesting stuff. So the Lecture Trust really is about gathering, creating a space where somebody who knows a thing or two about something can come and talk to us here in Hull, and then we can put that and make that available for the next generation on the Lecture Trust website. So do visit that. I should say, as part of the Wilberforce bit, that you might have found a little envelope somewhere near your seat. I ran out of time at the top, so I just dropped them at the end of the rows. But if you've got any money and you feel like giving some, there'll be a couple of boxes at the back that you can put those envelopes in. The other thing to just mention is the tie-up with the Freedom Festival, which happened for the first time last year because Kofi Annan, God rest him, was so big. Lots of people had to participate in that. So the Culture Company and the City Council were all heavily involved in that one. But it was the first time that we'd put on a lecture during the Freedom Festival. And the Freedom Festival was started in 2007 because that was the 200th anniversary of the abolition of the slave trade, as I'm sure you all know. So it seemed, and Mikey Martins and his team are really trying to take seriously the genesis of the thing, the point of the thing, rather than just to have a good time, although you're allowed to have a good time as well, and offer people the opportunity to think about some of these issues. So we're very pleased to be working with the Freedom Festival, and I think the Freedom Festival are quite pleased to be working with the Lecture Trust, so that's all to the good. So, Dr. Helen Pankhurst. I've read a reasonable amount about you that I could find in various places. And I know you're working in England now, but Helen was, I guess, born in Ethiopia and spent the first 12 years of her life and spent a bit of time at Sussex University, but aside from that, spent most of your time in a lot of other countries and not the UK. But and I'm really fascinated by Ethiopia, but anyway, never mind. But Helen now works for Care International UK, which Care International was the thing that started sending parcels to people after the Second World War from the United States. But has clearly got the idea somewhere in its history that if you give support, aid in some form or other to women, then that's likely to be much more effective in terms of getting the job done. So Care International is what you work for, but clearly Helen has a very important family, is part of a very important family. And I don't know whether you've been pursuing this for 20 or 30 years, but certainly it's clear that you're trying to use that lineage, Emmeline and then Sylvia, leaders of the suffragette movement, use that lineage to say some powerful things, not just about women's rights in this country, but women's rights all over the world. So that's the sort of thing that the Lecture Trust is very, very interested in. And we're extremely pleased to welcome you here. Helen will be this takes quite a while. This is not a standard lecture for us, so there isn't going to be a question and answer thing at the end. So you will be released, but when Helen's has finished speaking, I just have a very, excuse me, I can't speak, I'm so dry, a very brief presentation to do at the end of what she says. But anyway, over to Helen.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks so much. Just checking that you can hear me right at the back. Can you? Yes? Up there? Yeah, great. Thank you. On such a beautiful day, it's really wonderful that you're all willing to be here. And many thanks for being invited to give this memorial talk, this celebratory talk, and the link between the festival and the Wilberforce Lecture series. Really interesting to be part of that and to bring feminism in the mix. What I'd really like to do is have this session as interactive as possible, and to look at three things. The first is the suffragette movement and that personal legacy and linkage that I have, and to make a few points about that, but also to hear any questions that you might have and to answer those. So that's number one. So again, that will be interactively done. The second important piece is how far have women's rights gone since then, since 1918? What do we feel about the rate of progress? In politics, in economics, in women's personal lives, in their sense of identity, in their relationships with others? What about in terms of violence? How far have we got? What about in terms of culture and in terms of power? These themes are the ones that I use in this wonderful book of mine, which I must be promoting, and which is for sale outside afterwards, and I'll be signing. So it's that structure that I'm using to question how far we've got. And I'll be very interested to hear your thoughts. And again, we'll do this interactively. And any anecdotes that you want to add to the story will be really interesting. And then the last bit is, okay, so here we are, 2018, the centenary of when some women got the vote. But we have to wait for another 10 years to 2028, which is the centenary of when women got the rights equally with men. 10 years we had to wait. So we have 10 years now until that centenary. And my question is, what's our priority? If, as I expect we will find, and as I find in my book, we are not there yet, we haven't got full equality, what are the priorities? What should we be doing? And I'll be sharing some of my favourite anecdotes, both from the book and from some of the sessions that I've been giving with people about their thoughts about the priorities. So a lot to get through. I hope you're all willing to engage with it all. Yeah? Great. Okay. So, first part, the suffragettes. Hands up those of you who saw the series Shoulder to Shoulder that the BBC produced in the 1970s. Hands up if that's meaningful to any of you. A few hands going up, not that many. What about this film Suffragette? Okay, a lot more hands, but not universal. So for those of you who haven't put your hands up, and of course I'm not at all neutral, it's a brilliant film as a film, but it's also a really powerful film in terms of the issue of rights and the fight for change, with a focus on the suffragette storyline, but I think much more interesting even beyond that. I was involved in advising, and for those of you who saw the film, my main recommendation was, you know how at the end you're given the dates of when women got the vote in different countries? And that was my recommendation, because I thought that that universalizes the story, makes you realize how hard it has been to get to issues of political equality. And also it brought it to the present, because the last date there was actually 2015 and women in Saudi Arabia getting the vote. I also have a tiny role in the film, as does my daughter, and she beats me because she actually has one word, which is hello. More seriously, okay, hands up those of you who in your families have heard the story that women that it's really, really important to vote because women sacrificed so much to get the vote. So hands up if that's a story in your families. And I saw hands shooting straight up very, very quickly. And I think that's a really important legacy of the suffragette campaign, that sense of how important it was and how important it is we continue to value that and continue to vote, irrespective of all the complications around how visible or powerful your vote might or might not be in the current climate. I'm going to say a few more things and then open it up to any questions you might have, either about the suffragettes or the suffragists, or even being involved in the film, or personal, what's it like to be, that kind of thing. So I'm going to open it up very, very broadly, but just to say a few more things. So firstly, I think what the suffragettes and what the suffrage movement did more widely is bring women together for the first time across differences. So it brought women together from the far north to the far south, east and west. Here in Hull, for example, there was Mary Murdoch, who was both a suffragette and a suffragist. And important to say that because sometimes in the simplification of history, there's this very simple schism, the suffragist versus the suffragette. And actually, many people, many women worked across both of those movements. I can come back to that later on if that's a question that you have. So it brought women together across many differences, geographic, economic. The first militant act was done by a working class woman, Annie Kenney, and a middle class woman, Helen Pankhurst. So the first defining act of militancy was done by two women across class differences. It brought women together across age difference, socioeconomic backgrounds of many, household composition, sexuality. For the first time, women who were not straight, heterosexual women were visible in the movement and working together with others. Yet this movement that brought women together with this idea of the importance of the vote was also divided by so many issues. And that is important as we carry through to look at how far women have got over time, because the issue of what brings us together and what pulls us apart continues over time. It's part of the story of women's rights, is both the coming together and the schisms and the differences. So they were divided by things like, how do you do this? Is this about democracy, in which case the voice really matters? Or is this a military campaign against the odds where you really have to listen to the leader and you just do what you're told? What's the best way of doing this? Is this about incremental change? Do you just get the vote for some women? Just get the foot in the door? Or is this about fundamental transformation, in which case that's not good enough because you're leaving most people behind? Is this about just the vote? Let's just get the vote and then we can do all sorts of other things. Or do you believe that these issues are interlinked and you have to fight on other aspects like economic issues at the same time? How do you relate to other parties? Because you've got all of these parties, national parties, and do you say to yourself, okay, which political party is more likely to adopt women's rights issues, more likely to give women a vote? Or do you say, and excuse the language, sod you all, none of you are going to prioritise women? They were also divided by things like the war and by Irish Home Rule. The war was absolutely fundamental in dividing women into how to respond to it. In my own family, they were so divided by so many issues that, in fact, they're all four key women in the story. And when else in history have you got four key women as historical figures? So the four key women were divided so much that they're buried in different continents. How far can you take your disagreements? So Emmeline is buried in the UK. Christabel is buried in the States. Sylvia, my grandmother, in Ethiopia. And that's my storyline about my interest in international development comes from Sylvia. And then Adela is buried in Australia. A few more, maybe one last main comment. And that is that I think what's important when we think about the suffragettes is that this wasn't just about the vote. This was about, and it wasn't just about structural or institutional change. It was about two other things. Firstly, it was about agency. It was about individual women believing that they mattered, that what they thought mattered, that they should have a vision, ideas of themselves, they could do things with their lives. And that's the spark, the issue of women's agency. And the second aspect is social norms, changing society's views about what women are about, what they could dream to do, what their contribution should be. And then and now, it's the link between these three, between agency, between social norms change, and between structural or institutional change that actually delivers transformation. And arguably, and we can come back to this, I think it's the social norms bit that's the laggard in all of this, and it's the bit that we still need to do so much on. I want to share with you a couple of quotes that speak a bit to that idea from this wonderful book. This from Noor Al-Safar, a 14-year-old, and she talked about the Pankhurst legacy means I'm not afraid to have ambitions, not stupid to dream, not deluded for wanting to transform the world in which we live. They taught me, if they can make it possible, I can make it possible. Or Lady Rhonda, who was a campaigner at the time, who wrote, "The vote was really a symbol, and the militant fight itself did more to change the status of women because it did more to alter our own opinions of ourselves than ever the vote did. In actual fact, in those years, we were changing the attitude of a country, nay, of the world. That was infinitely worth the doing. Alter a nation's habit of mind, and the laws will alter themselves." So, I'm going to pause there, and I'm going to hope that lots of hands shoot up with any questions that you might have about any of this and how we get to 1918. Come on, audience of Hull. Any questions? Okay, lovely. I think there's some roving mics, I'm hoping. Yeah, they're coming. 1 second.
Thank you very much for the first part of your lecture. And I'm actually not having a question until 1918, but rather asking in regards to the current situation and the commemoration of such. It's not in such terms a question, but rather an invitation for reflection on how you experience the commemoration of the 100 years since the vote or the partial vote to go on within the UK as from a national perspective, but also looking in what does it mean in terms of international solidarity?
Lovely question. I think it's been amazing, the level of interest that has been generated. So I started this book about 3 years ago thinking some people are going to ask me, you know, actually the obvious question is, what would Emmeline think? What would she think of the world today? And I thought, okay, let me do some research and really find out what I think, how much things have changed, and be able to answer in a lot more detail, what I thought had happened over the last 100 years. Little did I know when I started to write how much the centenary would resonate in broader culture. And it feels like that there's a moment where those centenary celebrations have coincided with a sense of fed-upness about the rate of change, a sense in society here that really, come on, it's been 100 years. Do we really have to still be talking about exactly the same things? So coincidence or not, I don't know. Is it synergy that somehow has meant that these celebrations have come at a time when the issue of feminism is as alive and well and kicking as it has been for a long time? And I think that's in the UK, but it's globally, to different extents. Countries where women can articulate that, countries where they're just starting to, and the theme of things going forward and backwards is one that we could return to over time. But I have been really heartened by the level of engagement right across the country, again, north, south, east and west, with celebrations. A lot of it is celebrations plus. So it's, okay, a museum doing, bringing together some of the memorabilia of the suffragettes, but then saying, you know, and how far have we got? Or, and this is in parallel with this other fight historically in another country or on another issue. So I think that sense that nobody would want us just to be looking back. You know, the importance is to continue the fight. And I think there's a global sense that that's what it's about. Thank you. There was a question down here, I think. And I'm hoping there might be one from up there afterwards as well.
Thank you for coming to talk to us. It's a great honour. I would like to ask you to explain the difference between suffragettes and suffragists, and also to mention something about the tensions and the sacrifices of the 4 women of your family. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. So, there's a simplistic story, which is suffragists are the constitutional ones who were campaigning for women to get the vote well before the suffragettes started. The suffragettes started by Emmeline and her family, called the WSPU, the Women's Social and Political Union, nicknamed the suffragettes by the Daily Mail as a way of making fun of them. They actually liked the term, so they adopted it. Again, slightly simplistically, people talked about the fact that the suffragists just want the vote and suffragettes were going to get the vote. Actually, I think what's really interesting is how interwoven the 2 organisations are. The fact that they're splits of each of those. So it wasn't like you have just 2, the suffragists and the suffragettes, the WSPU and the National Women's Social, NUWSS. There were a lot of offshoots of each of those. And then you had many trade union organisations also involved. So I would prefer that we think about this rich tapestry of organisations that sometimes work together, sometimes were in conflict with each other, with individual women navigating across this. So somebody might start off as a suffragist, then become a suffragette, then get fed up with the militancy, then become a suffragist, or whatever. It's a much more complicated, textured story. And textured story is part of also your second point. So we have 4 key women. Emmeline was the mother figure. She was the mother and she was the mother figure and the icon who remains the icon of the feminist movement. If there's one person people associate with women's rights and political rights and fighting against the establishment, it tends to be Emmeline. She had 3 daughters. She had a couple of sons, one who died very young and another one who also died quite young, who was involved in the campaign. But she had 3 daughters who are more central to the story. Christabel was the strategist who worked very, very closely with her mother and was probably the most militant of the lot. And both Emmeline and Christabel moved more to the right politically. And one of the issues I didn't mention when I was talking about the fact that they came from different backgrounds is that women also came from different political views, from the far left to the far right to anywhere in between. So Christabel and Emmeline moved more to the right. Adela, the youngest, stayed very far left and moved to Australia and is no longer part of the story. Sylvia, my grandmother, was very left-wing and stayed so, remained so, was the founding member of the Communist Party, took up many issues that were in conflict with her mother and older sister. I think that over time, the world has moved more in Sylvia's direction, in that a lot of the views that she held up are ones that I think we all espouse more. But to give you, so as not to take too long, just to give you a couple more examples of the differences. One was, and these are central to the split. So Sylvia thought that this should be a democratic movement. Emmeline and Christabel thought that this should be about leadership, and you'd get those who are most likely to have power and to get it quickly, and you influence them, and then you can deal with everybody else. That was the position they took over time. It wasn't where they started. Sylvia also took on many other issues. So she thought it was important to look at the practical constraints that women in the East End of London, which is where she ended up campaigning, that the practical constraints on women were really, really important. So you couldn't just look at strategy. You needed to support women and get them to work around things like creches. And so there was a pub that was turned into the Mother's Arms, which was the creche. There was a low-cost restaurant so that people could eat more cheaply, a number of other initiatives. But Sylvia also felt that the social taboo against women that were not married and women who had children out of wedlock was problematic, and she wanted to counter that. So her partner was my grandfather. He was an Italian anarchist, And so Silvio didn't get married, partly because he was an Italian anarchist, and anarchists didn't believe in marriage, number one. Secondly, because Silvia had this point about countering the social norms that forced you to do that. Even when she had a son, my father felt it was important just to be proud of that and not to take on, to be the owned by the man. So it was her feminist views. Thirdly, really, really importantly, if she had married Silvio, she would have lost her British nationality, because at the time, a woman who got married to a non-Brit would lose her nationality automatically. So she would have lost her right to vote. And there was no way she would have done that. Meanwhile, you have Emmeline, her mother, who was standing as a Conservative Party candidate, clearly very, very frustrated with this daughter of hers who was doing all of these things that were very media-worthy. So reasons for split, many others, but a few as an example. I can take one question from up there, if there is one that anybody... You might have to shout, because I don't think the... I'll repeat the question.
Do you think the women would have won the vote if they hadn't been so militant? And then going on from that, do you think we should use militancy in activism today?
Okay. Did everybody hear the question? No. Okay, first question was, did the militancy actually slow things down? And the second is, should we be using militancy today? So on the first point, I think that what's really important, actually, when you think about the suffragettes is not to default too quickly to the militancy, because they did so many things, and they were memorable for so many of the things that they did. So they were lateral thinkers, you know, the colours, purple, white and green, still today symbolic of feminism in so many countries. The Women's Equality Party here used those colours. So, you know, colour branding, merchandising, very, very clever campaigning in the home, in public spaces, everywhere. So I think that there was an innovativeness, a cleverness about how they campaigned that's part of the story. Then part of the story is this complete commitment to the cause as the state became more and more violent and restricted their opportunities to move. And as their opportunities to move was restricted, they responded with more and more militancy. So I think the militancy needs to be looked at in terms of the relationship with the state that was obstructive of it, rather than, you know, we decide to be militant just abstractly. And I think that I'm not convinced it delayed issues at all. I think this was a very rigid structure, rigid society, where actually by that point, most of Parliament believed women should get a vote, but you had two dinosaurs who didn't, Asquith and Lloyd George. And remember those words about dinosaurs, because I'll come back to it, because we live right now in a world of global dinosaurs who still have absolute power to do things without accountability and in rather problematic ways. And I think that those dinosaurs were using the excuse of the militancy to say, not now. And another point that often comes up is, what about the war? Was it because of the war that women got the vote? And my answer to that is no, that the war provides an excuse, the war provides a pause, the war provides a change of dynamics, but actually I think women would have got the vote beforehand if we hadn't had the vote, if we hadn't had the war. And the reason why it doesn't work as the argument that it's the war that gave women the vote is partly because it's very convenient, isn't it? Oh, it's because of the war, not because of women's rebellious agency, it's because of the war. But also the women who got the vote were not the working class young women who were the ones at the forefront of working at the munitions. They were the last to get the vote. So a more complicated story there. I do want to share with you one rather funny anecdote to do with the militancy, though, because I really like it. In general, male bastions of privilege were favoured targets for militant action. An official at the Tunbridge Wells cricket pavilion unwisely quipped, "It is not true that women are banned from the pavilion. Who do you think makes the tea?" The suffragettes responded by burning it down. to your second point about militancy, I think we have to ask, what is militancy? I think in many societies globally, women speaking out, women demanding an education, women demanding it to be counted is considered militancy. So, so I think some kind of calling things out, some kind of quite forceful action is required. But I think humour, lateral thinking, clever antics are more powerful still. And militancy in the simple, violent form should be relegated to almost not being visible at all in the UK, where we have democratic space and where I'm defining militancy in terms of arson and the kind of things that they did before. Okay, I'm going to move on to how far have things got in the last 100 years. How am I doing with speed? Are you okay? Yeah. Okay. So the first chapter goes on to look at politics and how far we've got there. So we've got, 32% of women in the House of Commons, 26% of women in the House of Lords. But it's not just about numbers, it's also about attitudes. In terms of attitudes, how's this from Earl Ferrers in 1957, who said, "Why should we encourage women to eat their way like acid into metal, into positions of trust and responsibility? If we allow women in the House, where will this emancipation end?" Apparently he did change his mind, and at the end he was going through the lobby quite happily with women peers. But like acid into metal? And that sense that women in the political space have often felt like that they don't belong, they continue to feel that they don't belong, continues over time. And in the chapter on politics, I'm not just talking narrowly about Parliament, I'm also talking about the legislature, another aspect of the democratic space. And if we look at the position of women in the law, again, we have women in some leadership positions right up at the top, as we do in Parliament. But that doesn't mean to say you don't have structural inequalities still. And that's also about how women feel. So this from Jane. "When I first started here, I had a real feeling of being an imposter. I laugh about it now, but at the time, I literally used to die a little inside every time someone spoke to me. And it does come back to me every now and again. For example, if I go to a meeting and there are very few women, but all the men seem to know each other, I have to tell myself I am supposed to be there and that people aren't looking at me, wondering if I've walked into the wrong room by mistake." And really, really critically, the democratic relationship that citizens have with the political space is mediated through the media. And how gender neutral is the media? Even the political media. What happens when the political media have to talk about something that's vaguely linked to feminism or to women's interests? When it involves women, the topic under consideration is trivialised and sexualised. There were 43 main recommendations made by the Good Parliament report of 2016. This was a report commissioned by the Speaker, a really important piece of research. 43 main recommendations. The media, including serious media, zoned in on breastfeeding, which had been mentioned as a sub-point to a proposal for a clear policy on maternity, paternity, adoption and care leave. As a former Minister and Liberal Democrat MP, Jo Swinson, commented, "It's a journalistic equivalent of pinging a girl's bra strap and thinking it's hilarious. Boobs, they mentioned boobs." So, how far have we got in terms of politics? What I decided to do in the book is, after quite a lot of statistics and many anecdotes, I wanted to be able to summarise and also to think about how I felt, how far we'd got in politics compared to, say, in economics or in terms of women's lives and their relationships or in terms of violence. So I decided to score each chapter from 0 to 5. So 5 would mean that I thought in that area we'd got equality, 0 would mean I thought we hadn't moved at all. And then 1, 2, 3 would be somewhere in between. So what I'd like to do is ask all of you to put your fingers up, saying how far you think we've got in terms of women in politics over the last 100 years. Just if you all put your fingers up and then look around you and see what other people are scoring. And I'll also say, so I'm seeing threes, twos, threes, the odd one, 2 threes, I would say, but it's ranging between 2 and 3 as the overall score. Does anybody who scored a 1 or a 4 want to share why they've done so? And hang on a minute, we'll get the mic. It's right here, sorry.
Hello. Because the Labour Party still hasn't had a woman leader, and we're supposed to be socialists. And the other thing is that women in politics are still judged by how they dress.
Yeah. Okay, did everybody hear that? So the first is because we still don't have a woman as a leader we haven't had a women leader of the Labour Party. And the second is that women are still judged by how they dress. Does somebody who scored a 4 want to share why they scored a 4? I don't think there were any 5s and any 0s. So any 4s? Anybody want to share? No, okay. I think that overall, I would say that was between a 2 and a 3, and interesting to have the outliers. By the way, there's I had a conversation with Emily Thornberry about that point of why, and it often comes up, how come the Conservatives have had 2 women prime ministers and Labour hasn't, and yet Labour has proportionately so many more and has fought for it in so many ways. And Emily Thornberry's view was that actually, like it or not, the Labour Party has a group mentality thinking, that's where it comes from. It comes from a working class, ideas of equality and that kind of group coming together. And that in that sense of group coming together, women are the outliers. Women are always not centre stage of that group. They're always on their own, slightly outside the group, and that's why. Whereas, as a thought, whereas in the Conservative Party, it's a party of individuals. Individualism is encouraged, and therefore a person can come and lead. Let me move on to the second chapter. Second chapter is called Money, and it's looking at women's financial autonomy, their working lives. And let me start by saying that women have always worked. And I'm talking about paid work, not just the other forms of work, which I'll come on to next. So they've always done some paid work. It's the kind of paid work that doesn't count, that society doesn't value. But if we look at the other type of work that women were allowed to get involved in, they were brought in with the First World War when men went to the front. Then they were told to go back home. They were brought in again for the second time with the Second World War. Then they were told to go back home. And then there's a lot around married women, the bar for married women not being allowed to work. In living memory, if you were married, you had to stop work. And then there's issues around major change because of education. So as women start to be educated more and more, opportunities increase in terms of their options at work. But there was always the issue of what education they got. So this from Liz. I wasn't allowed to take chemistry O-level. For those of you who are younger, O-levels, GCSEs. So I wasn't allowed to take chemistry O-level, and I was told I had to do needlework instead. I'm proud of my U, unclassified, gained at the end of the course. In the written paper, I was asked, your husband is going on a business trip. What do you pack for him? My answer, I don't. He does it himself. I wasn't trying to be clever. It just had no connection with my life. My dad was an electrician. When would he have gone on a business trip? I was meant to say that I would pack his socks in his shoes, which would be at the bottom of the suitcase. This was in 1981. I'm very proud of my younger self, says Liz. And then there's questions about wealth and how equal wealth distribution has become over time. So this from Susan. My mother left Ireland to get away from how unfairly she was treated as a woman. Her 5 brothers all inherited or were bought farms on marriage. My mother was given nothing and often said she wouldn't leave my dad if she wanted to, as she had nothing in her own name, although she worked her fingers to the bone. And that issue of women not being able to allow to take out mortgages or hire purchase or own property, again, very, very recent times, that not being able to take out things without the signature of a man to legitimize it, to allow it to happen. The story repeats. My younger brother inherited the farm in Northern Ireland, even although he'd lived away in Spain for many years. His 7 older sisters inherited nothing. This was in 2012. So much progress in terms of women's financial autonomy in so many ways. Women working as so central to women's identity now. And yet the pay gap issues, we saw that, there's a pay strike in 1918 in Willesden with bus conductors doing a pay strike in 1918, wanting them to get the same bonuses that the men had and for equal wages. They won the bonus fight, they lost the wages fight. And then in the 1970s, all the work to get equal pay. And now with the gender pay gap reporting still highlighting how much we still have pay gaps. And that's in general, without then looking at issues such as maternity gaps and pension gaps. But we have got quite far. So what do we think? Remember, your averages were between 2 and 3 for how far you thought we'd got in the political sphere. How far do you think we've got in the economic sphere? And again, fingers up and let's see what you think. So I'm seeing 3s, 1s, 5s, 3s, 1s, 3s, 2s. Okay, does somebody want to share? Let's share 1 or 2 of your views. Anybody, put your hands up if you'd like to share your anecdote. There's one there.
Hello. So many reasons why I think it's only 1. So we have obviously the gender pay gap, those sorts of things well publicised. But I think, for every child that you have as a woman, you earn a fair bit less, something like 13% less. Women who work part-time are seen as putting family above their career. For every as a working mother, you are deemed to be, everyone's watching if you leave early or if you were, scooting in the door just as everything starts. But yeah, if you're a father, it actually advances your career. I think we've seen so many impacts in recent years in terms of austerity that have directly impacted on women, universal credit, those sorts of things, the fact that women's refuges are being closed, women are being turned away because they don't have access to benefits, so therefore they can't pay. So many problems in terms of money that then impact on everything else.
Okay, does somebody who scored a 4 or 5 want to share why they did that, or their thoughts on that? Come on. Those who feel that actually we've moved forward a lot, and it might be that there's personal reasons for that, personal anecdotes. Thank you.
I didn't score a 4 or a 5, I scored a 2, but there's various areas where possibly women do have a 4, a higher area in, say, professional jobs like teaching or management. But then there's still areas where women are right down at the bottom. For example, motor vehicle engineering or construction. The woman's future in those industries is virtually nil. So you've got a disparity between different areas.
Thank you. They used to talk about women being predominant in the 5 C's, working in the 5 C's. Do you know what the 5 C's are? Caring, cooking, cleaning, and the others is cashiering and clerking. And those were the less valued, continue to be less valued by society. And yet even in those areas, if you look at the people at the very top, it tends to be men. So both horizontal and vertical inequalities creeping in. Valuation, how we value things, how we valued and how we continue to value things. So unfairly, so unjustly, so stupidly. Yeah, can you do that one? Yeah. You can do that as yeah. I think we should all be doing that, actually. You know, because in what world and why does it not matter? Is it less important to educate the next generation and to look after them? Why is that less important than being whatever it is that gets counted? Why is physical infrastructure so much more valued and counted than social infrastructure? Okay, I'm going to move on to the third, and we have, in a way, with some of the points being raised. The third chapter is on women's lives, which have doubled in length. It's about their sense of self. It's about the fact that sexual reproductive rights have massively increased. Women are no longer having 12 children and being defined by being mothers with 12 children. So many more options to deviate from the norm in terms of that whole issue about when or whether you get married, if you have children, what kind of partner you have. A lot more flexibility, society slightly less narrowly rigid in terms of what it's valuing and what it's saying you should do. And the complexity, okay, so another point central to this chapter, which is on called identity, is the fact that women's identity is still centrally about their relationship with their families. It's not so for men. For men, you don't have to say immediately what their structural context is, what their families are like. For women, you do. Even in the whole issue about the Mr. on the one hand and the Ms., Mrs., blah, all of that stuff on the other. Can you do the what bit? Yeah. So the women's relationships with their families so central to the very identity of being a woman. And that's very complicated for women. So take this from Annie. My aim is to raise my children to be happy and healthy. Yes, it's not very equal to be home whilst my husband is working, but it's what I want. Maybe I've been conditioned that way after seeing my mother and grandmother do the same. But I've also seen the successes that they achieved and their quiet power. They are my heroes, and I'd like to follow in their footsteps. But how often is that still an opportunity now? Economically, is that still even possible? And also in terms of social norms, is that even valued anymore? And that's back to that point about what we value. But there's also, for those who try and do it all, or who try and do that domestic role, the difficulties, the problems that they encounter with it. So this from Anne. Somewhere around that time, I started to slip into a rather undefined world where I became less of an individual and more a support to others. I was there for my husband, for my children, and for my aging parents. And while this evolving, kinder, more caring persona developed, another side of me lost definition and direction. So I would say that issue about women centrally defined and defining themselves through their relationship with others is still at the core and very different from the way that we look at men. And the other issue is that, and we've touched on this already, it's what women look like that matters. For men, it's what they say and do that's central. For women, society, we ourselves, what you look like that matters. And yes, everybody's fighting against this in many different ways, but it's still so all pervasive in culture, in advertisements, in the books that we read, in the cinema that we watch, everywhere. This from Elizabeth. Before I started chemotherapy, I was sent off to choose a wig. I surprised myself by choosing a long, luscious brunette wig. Nothing like my scruffy, short, undyed grey hair. A little later, I joined a makeup tutorial in a cancer group meeting set up to feel like a pamper party and came away with a bag full of free lipstick, eyeshadow, foundation, and blusher. Of course, I didn't have to do these things, but they seemed to be the norm, and somehow I felt that doing them made me more acceptable, a good breast cancer patient. And then linked to that issue of what women look like is a sense that also that what they look like and what they are is owned by men, and that men have the right to make decisions over what women are about. And this is expressed in so many different ways, but just to give you one example. Lynn, I'm now 45. All my boyfriends have asked me to remove my pubic hair. which shows the entitlement men feel they have with regard to the female body. The only difference is that men over the last 5 to 10 years have asked much sooner than they used to, which I think ties in with the increased exposure to online porn, as opposed to the mags of before. I've always said no categorically without hesitation. It's my body, not theirs. And also linked to that idea about what women look like and society's control of all of that, there's so much that could be said, including the fact that these things, that young girls from the age of 9, 10 onwards, the all-pervasive social media focus on girls, on what they look like. They themselves are internalizing this in very narrow definitions of beauty. The pressure of all of that as something that I think is quite scary. So, looking at all of this area, how far have we got? I mean, massive, if we come back to some of the points I made earlier, massive, massive gains for women, massive transformations, and yet these niggly concerns about how society still views women, how we view our own identity. So let's have fingers up again and let's see. I think we had between 2 and 3 for the first chapter. I would say you went down for the second. So let's see what we think for this one. So fingers, hands up, what are you thinking? 1s, 3s, 1s, 2, 2, 2s, 2s, 3s and 1s. I would say roughly the same, possibly slightly lower than the last chapter. Does anybody want to share an anecdote or thoughts on this? And we have a... Oh.
Thank you. The child free through choice, which is something that's come in obviously since contraception was more obviously widely available, more reliable contraception. How do we think that the early suffragettes would think of that choice that women can have now if they want to, compared to that we were the baby breeders for the post-First World War and Second World War expected to repopulate, when it's possible that we have a lack of resources now in the whole world and climate change coming? Do you think that there might be more women going child-free through choice? Could that be something in the future?
Interesting. In lots of countries we are seeing that, aren't we? There are many countries where, in particular I'm thinking of Japan, where so many women hate what society is saying you should become, and by choice are saying, I don't want that. I've got the freedoms that I can have as soon as I am married and have children. I no longer have those freedoms, and it's creating major discussion points and angst about it. What would the suffragettes think? I think the answer probably is it depends which ones, because they had so many different views. But ultimately, I think they would be in favour of agency, of the right of individuals to choose what they wanted. And I think that would be the most powerful point about it. There were a couple of hands up just here.
I wondered how you felt about the fact that in the end the women have the last laugh, because the average life expectancy for women is 84 and for men 74.
Yeah. I'm not too sure how to answer that one. Yeah, let me think about how to answer that. I mean, you know, I think that quality of life is also really, really important. So it's what they do with that and what they've done with the earlier years as well. Yeah, there was let me take one more. There was one more just here, I think. Yeah. Just.
Hi there. Thank you. It was just with regards to women and young children being told what they have to wear, what they can and cannot wear. Our daughter's 14 and we've just found out from her school now there's a specific type of skirt they've got to wear. She was always modest, everything. But this is the pressure that they're putting on these young girls, like you say, through social media, etc., but dictating to them exactly what length their skirt needs to be, what style it needs to be. I just don't understand where they think they have this inherent right to dictate to women and young women what they should and shouldn't wear. I know myself, I'm currently studying a law degree, and as a very mature student, as you can probably tell, But I'm even dictated to what I can wear in and out of court. I've got to wear skirts. I've got to wear tights. And it's ridiculous. When will people realise that what women wear does not define their ability to do their job or to learn?
Yeah. Totally agree, and in all cultures seem to be doing that, and it's being fought in different ways. The individual right, the woman's right to wear whatever she wants to, absolutely. I'm going to move on to the next chapter, which is on violence, and just ask you first and see what you think. How far do you think we've got in terms of the issue of violence? So hands up before I say anything, and then I'll share with you my thoughts on this. So turn this around a bit. I'm seeing ones and even zeros. 2 as the highest I've seen so far. 2 as the highest. 2 as the highest. Which is also my sense that actually, and I hate this, I hate that violence which victimizes women brings us back down, all the scores down, and our sense of self, our opportunities to be speaking about women as survivors and women, about agency and all these other things that we want to be talking, and yet violence pulls us down. It infected chapter 1 on politics, Joe Cox and all the Twitter stuff that women and any other person that doesn't fit the norm is exposed to. Violence infected chapter 2, the whole Me Too stuff that we hear, that we know about now, but it's in so many other forms at work as well. Violence affected women at homes, both in traditional ways and in other ways as well. And as we have become more diverse with issues such as FGM and honour killings and so on as well, violence infecting culture, because so much of our culture is imbued with this idea of violence by men against women. So really, really majorly problematic. And part of me thinks if this is a sectoral solution, I would be saying, come on, it's the one area that's dragging us down. But I don't think it's a sectoral solution. I think that actually we have to be tackling this on all fronts, and it's all of our responsibilities to be doing that. And it's not just by looking at violence. I think we have to look at all sorts of things, such as how we are forced, what clothes we're forced to wear, what subjects we're allowed to study, what opportunities we have to work, how we are treated in the family in terms of who takes the burdens of what work, etc. I can come on to all of that in a minute, but I just want to share with you a little bit from chapter 5, which is the chapter on culture, because on chapter on culture, I think there's a lot more positive things to be said. You know, we are out there in the pubs and in the public spaces. We are beginning to have our own narratives. The feminine lens is there for so many films and plays and books. Still a minority, still in terms of pay, major inequality. Sports, for example, look at that. Yes, women are so much more visible in the sports, but pay inequalities and all the other issues still so central. But a couple of quotes on the more positive side of this, if you will. And this is from Frances Morris. And by the way, the quotes are from a mixture of well-known people and just people that I interviewed in the course of writing the book. So Frances Morris is the director of the Tate Modern, and she must be in her early 60s. And she says, "There's something powerful about my generation of women who have been brought up with gender bias from birth, regulating our personal and professional lives, and finding, not surprisingly, that now, empowered as a result of largely our own actions, we find a different way forward as leaders, managers, and colleagues. After so long on the margins, this is gratifying. The margins are the place in the forest where the great mushrooms grow, in soil that has been raked over and disturbed, but often disregarded. My generation has likewise been somewhat trampled, but like the best mushrooms in the margins, we're now showing our heads." Isn't that lovely? Really like that quote. And this is from Jude Kelly, who is the artistic director at the South Bank Festival and has been involved in starting the Women of the World festivals right across the country and globally. So she said, "If women's life stories are seen to be purely domestic, purely romantic, they cannot be seen to contribute to world thinking, even though the domestic and romantic are world thinking too. So when a man writes about love, it's an existential examination. When a woman writes about love, it's a personal, romantic, sentimental journey. This is one example of a pattern in the way we value men and women differently. Yet the experiences that women have, including their knowledge of inequality, is one that can make the world a much better one for all. We need to get to a place where women can bring that knowledge of systemic injustice and a different perspective into the centre of our society, into the centre of influence. And in a way, that quote is a reminder, I think, about how interrelated issues of feminism are with all other fights for equality, be that about class, colour, gender, sexuality, I've already mentioned gender, but all of these. And I think it's really important not to just think of this as a separate battle on its own. It's connected with all the other issues of privilege. And that's why, you know, coming back to the dinosaurs versus issues of equality, I think right now we live in a world where we have the rise of these global dinosaurs, well, these dinosaurs in different countries. But we also have the rise of a resistance to it, a really powerful resistance of people who believe that equality is the way forward. And I think now more than ever, we really have to engage because we've seen the dangers of things going backwards, you know, in so many countries. And we have to, there's no choice. There's no just being on the sideline and saying this doesn't matter. Because it does matter, it matters to all of us. And all of us can make a difference in different ways, chipping away at different spaces. One of my favourite quotes, I think this is probably the last one I'll read to you, is from Mitch, who was a prison governor, talking about the danger of letting go. So she says, change can sometimes be of the elastic band kind. You take the strain and stretch forward for progress. You begin to see real change, new motivations, a future. And then you ease the pressure, you tire, you're moved to a new post. Vital funding is cut. And the elastic band does what it does best, snaps back to its original shape. So you can't let up the pressure, can't relax, can't ever believe the job is done. And that's the mistake feminists and feminist institutions make, believing that an issue is solved and it's okay to take your eye off the ball. So I'm not going to ask you for your quotes. What I'd like to do, or sorry, for your figures on how far we've got on culture. What I'd like to do is ask you to talk to your neighbour in a minute. Let me just share with you some of my favourite thoughts about how to go forward. So I'm moving into the third part of the talk, and that is, well, now what? We've seen in all these areas that there's still so much to be done. And my sense is that this is about agency, all of us individually. And it's about social norms change, changing society's views about so many of these things. And to some extent, it's about legal or institutional change, but much less so, because we have so many laws. It's about implementing them in this country. In other countries, it might be different. And by the way, that structure that I use a lot of agency, social norm, and institutional change is one that CARE International uses a lot in its programming. So some of my favourite suggestions that I've come across either from the book or elsewhere, somebody who was actually a colleague of mine at CARE called Jo. So what she said, what we need to do is photoshopped images should have a sign at the bottom, just like cigarette packages have a sign at the bottom saying this damages your health. Somebody said that, you know how we have to pay a licence fee to have watch TV? Well, they said, how about women pay half the licence fee on the basis that the BBC only pays women half what it pays the men? Somebody else suggested there should be a kite mark for literature for young kids that is given to books that are actually more progressive in the way that with films there's the F rating and there's a number of ways that films can be rated now. Another suggestion was that, so somebody in a group, in a conversation that I was having said, pockets. She said, I have a son and a daughter. The boy's got pockets, the girl doesn't have pockets. She said, well, what's society saying? What is this? And then somebody else in the group said, hang on a minute, it's not just the kids, it's the adults as well. So why? And so she's starting a campaign to make sure that the pockets are the same. And somebody else said, actually, just look at the material for the kids' clothes and the difference between the materials for the girls and the boys, let alone all the pinkification and all the other stuff that goes on. Another suggestion was that all 14-year-old boys should spend a little bit of time dressed up as a very feminized girl and just see how the world responds to him, her. Now, I shared that with at a men's prison where I gave a talk a little while back. And one of the guards there said, seems a bit like revenge to me. Many people, this is maybe a theme that somebody said, and it came up a lot, was that have we spent too much time trying to change the outside world, you know, work and politics and the public space? And have we not spent enough time transforming the personal and domestic spaces? That maybe, just maybe, if we'd spent more time on ensuring equality in the domestic spaces, we'd get further in the public spaces. So I'll leave you a few minutes just to talk to your neighbour, talk amongst yourselves, and then hopefully we'll pick up one or two of your, we might have time for a bit more. So if you want to share some of your findings, your suggestions, so just talk amongst yourselves. So the question is, what safe spaces can we create for people, for women? And given the political sensitivity of that very idea of safe spaces as well. I think my answer would be that I think everybody needs to look at what area that they can influence, where they can ensure change and work together with others. I personally think that there's a massive need for safe spaces, and in particular around violence, but also in terms of political voice and so on. One of the reasons why Emmeline set up the WSPU was also because she felt that it was important to have a women's-led movement where it was women that matters, it was women's agency there talking together, learning the skills, learning to speak, to fundraise, to campaign, to make decisions, to make mistakes, but still to do it together. And that the role of men in this should be as support, not as partners side by side. Because if you bring partners, men, side by side with women in equal numbers, then because of the history of male domination, it becomes, you don't allow that women's voice. You don't allow the second lens. The second lens is always the subservient lens. So I personally think that there's still a massive need for many reasons for women-only spaces. I also think that we won't get anywhere without having men involved in the dialogue as well. And as I mentioned earlier, the dinosaurs versus those who believe in equality, women can be dinosaurs as well, and men can be very much at the forefront of the ideas of equality. So I think it's really, really important that we don't do this binary thing and think that the problem is that all men and that all women are the solution. Very much, I don't believe that at all. I also think that this is all about spectrums, and whenever we put people in boxes, that's problematic, that actually all of this should be more about spectrums. I wanted to say that one kind of maybe slightly silly point, but about how one of the questions that often comes up linked to that is, you know, what's the role of men in all of this? What's the role of women and what's the role of men in changing this conversation and ensuring equality? And I've thought hard about this one, and I've ended up with the following, which is that in physics, bear with me, but in physics, you can have particle theory or wave theory at the same time, yeah? And this is totally, it doesn't make any sense at all, but we are allowed in physics, which is the most structured, logical, factual subject of all, to have both particle and wave theory at the same time. Well, I feel the same about men's role in feminism, in that partly I want to defend to the ends the importance of women having spaces where they can speak, where they can change the man-made structures and thinking and really envisage something different. Because this isn't about just equality, this is about difference, this is about a new lens. And I really think that women-only spaces can create that and motivate that in ways that are different. And at the same time, I fundamentally believe that men's engagement in this is about transforming the very ideas of masculinity and femininity, and that it's in their interests and their voice is absolutely pivotal. And really, really, we can't have women's only spaces. And I believe both at the same time. Okay, so let's, any more up there that wanted to share their discussion? No, yep. Yeah. Yeah. The question is, what do you think about women in fundamentalist religions, including Catholicism? Yeah, good question. In terms of the one country where women still can't vote, it is, of course, the Vatican City. I think religion and fundamentalist religion at the extreme is problematic because it is so male constructed. Historically, layers and layers and layers of that. It's not the religions per se, it's the structures, the cultural centuries of millennia of male dominations that it's all linked to. By the way, apparently Emmeline was once asked what would God make of her antics, to which her response was, I'm sure she would approve. Any question? Anybody wants to share from here? Can we have?
I was very lucky to go to Singapore this year, and the woman on the coach was going round, and the women in that society are getting that powerful now. They've got their own properties, and what do you say to that part? Like you mentioned Japan, it's happening there where people are getting more and more, the women are kind of getting the ARA's jobs. What's your thoughts on that?
So just to clarify, my thoughts on women getting the jobs that...
They don't need the men. They don't need the men anymore. They're buying their own properties. They're going it alone, yeah. Even with the kids as well. Yeah.
So I was just reading a book on women in China, and there was a whole process, with the Chinese, under Mao Zedong, there was a lot of ideas about women's equality in China. And then came the pushback, and this is about that business about the elastic band, because they were given many, many opportunities and rights. And then things defaulted back to women not having a lot of rights at all, including with the general, there was the equivalent of a privatization of property that happened. And they only had one name on the documents. So it resulted in this massive shift so that women no longer had the right for property. I think globally it's still a massive issue. I think having both names on the certificate has to be the more safe options. And, I wouldn't want this world to be replaced by one where women have all the power, and that's, perpetuating the problem. Has people read the book Power? Yeah, I mean, that's a dystopia where women are suddenly controlling everything. But in the meantime, I do absolutely think that it's important that women are on all these legal documents that are about property, because without that, that vulnerability is continued. Not sure I've totally answered your question, but have I? Is that okay? Yeah, not quite. Sorry. Maybe come back to me afterwards. Okay, anybody here want to share? Yeah.
Okay, so just really an observance. Earlier, when you mentioned the girl from 1981 who wasn't allowed to do chemistry O-level, I did my O-levels in '86. I was top of the whole year for history, and I loved history, still do now. But I was told I wasn't allowed to do history because it clashed with the timetable for domestic science. And I had to do my O-level in domestic science, completely flunked it, didn't do any good. But conversely, I've been brought up by a very strong mother who was a nurse in the 1960s. When I was born in 1970, my sister was born in 1971, and before I was 2.5, she went back to work because she was determined she wasn't just going to stay at home being a mother. She was strong enough to do what she wanted to do and what she'd worked towards, as well as bring us up. And yet she still allowed me to be overruled on my history O-level. And it's just kind of, it's a bit, it's converse really. So.
I think that raises a really interesting point as well, which is that we're all implicated in this, and sometimes we push forward in some areas, and we're saying it, to be a feminist, you really have to fight on this, this, and this. And at the same time, because we are part of the culture, we are reinforcing these same hierarchies in so many ways. And I think just an acknowledgement that we're all doing that all the time. And yes, we try and fight in some areas, but we will be called out, or we will just say, well, I mean, I mean, the obvious one is things like surnames. You know, if I asked, okay, let's do it this way. Hands up if you, as a woman, have kept your surname after marriage. Okay. Hands up as a woman if you have changed your surname as in marriage. Okay, I don't know whether you've noticed, but a lot more of the second. Now let me ask the men. Hands up. Hands up as a man if you've changed your name when you got married. Any, please, let there be at least one. None. Okay, so point taken that we're, you know, all still, we're fighting in different ways, but there's so many ways in which we don't see all of this. And I think there's a cross-generational issue as well. Okay, another question. I was asked this at a panel. If you had the choice between being a 16-year-old when you were 16 and a 16-year-old now, which would you choose? So hands up if you would rather have been a 16 when you were 16. A lot of hands going up, okay? Hands up if you would rather be a 16-year-old now. Much fewer. And I think this is, for me, it's speaking to the issue that we really have to be sensitive to cross-generational issues. And sometimes there's this assumption that the young generation has it all. Yeah.
Do you think that campaigns and fighting for women's equality will also, in the long run, benefit equality for some of the other groups who are perhaps equally or even further excluded from society?
I'm probably going to take that as the last question, actually, because I think it's a brilliant one to end on, and it is 3 o'clock. Fundamentally, and I feel this from the bottom of my heart and as strongly as I possibly can, so I don't know how you, if we are not looking at feminism in terms of the interlinkages with all the other inequalities, then we are failing the very idea of feminism. It has to be looking at other issues, other vulnerabilities. And again, it's back to these are spectrums. These are spectrums of how we should be allowed to be. We should be allowed to be, you know, not just male or female or heterosexual or homosexual or black or white, because none of these categories make any sense. It's a lot more complicated than that. And the more we support each other across our differences, and the more we fight for others, not just in our areas, but in where we have power, because we all have power and we have vulnerabilities. If we use our power to support others, knowing that others will also do the same, I think we'll end up being there, doing a better job of it. So I'm just going to close on that idea that all of us have a role. We can do so much. We have to do so much, because it would be awful if we don't use these 10 years to maximise change. Let's use these 10 years to really make sure that the next generation has a better life, a better world in which we are supporting everybody. Thank you.